today we get to have some good times together, I think. And I think to get us ready, we probably need prayer. All right. Well, I was greeted by some folks in my office this week who warned me that these chapters are long, and I got a little worried. But, I think we're going to be okay. So, Book 3, Chapter 4, title of this chapter is Morality and Psychoanalysis. 88, I said that we will never get a Christian society unless most of us become Christian individuals. But it's not something that we can just say, and we should not just say, oh, well, until that happens, I guess there's really not much we can do. He says that there are two things that we ought to be doing simultaneously. One is to continually apply the golden rule, and that secondly, we should continually strive to be people who live by that rule. And so, while it is probably true that we will never really have a Christian society until most of the people in that society are Christians, it does not mean that we should throw up our hands and say, well, until everybody's a Christian, I guess it's just going to be what it is. That we as a church have a responsibility to live by the words of Jesus. He makes two general points. The first is that Christian morality is about putting the human machine right. He made that point in the previous chapters, that he calls our human condition a matter of the human machine not functioning the way it's supposed to function. And so Christian morality is the mechanism by which God puts the human machine right again. The second general point he makes, but he doesn't get to it for several chapters, pages, sorry, is that our moral choices lead us either to becoming more of a heavenly creature or more of a hellish creature. And so we'll return to that later. But to the first point, the one that says that Christianity is about putting the human machine right, we turn to the question, how does that concept relate to psychoanalysis? And of course, he's writing at a time when the works of Freud and of Carl Jung were very well known and discussed. And so he says that psychoanalysis, which we ought to distinguish from the musings of Freud, because Freud wrote on a lot of things, but not all of it was truly technically psychoanalysis. But psychoanalysis, he says, is not, C.S. Lewis says, is not in contradiction to Christianity, because Christian morality and psychoanalysis are doing two different things. They have two different purposes. So he talks, and he says that when a person is making a moral choice, there are two things involved. One is the act of choosing itself, that activity of making a choice. The other is the raw material of that choice. And that involves a person's particular feelings and impulses. And so there is the act of choosing, but then there is also the raw material from which a person is actually making that choice. And he says that raw material consists of two kinds. First is the normal, that which we would say is common to all people. And then there is the unnatural feelings due to what's gone wrong in the person's subconscious. And so the raw material that you and I have as we go about making choices involves both that raw material which is common to all people, and then there is also our own proclivities, our own idiosyncrasies that we all have. And so he says, in talking about this raw material, he says on page 89, the fear of things that are really dangerous would be an example of the first kind, of the things that are common to all people. If we are in harm's way, and it's truly, clearly a matter of being in harm's way, then that would be something that's common to all people. But then the second kind would be an irrational fear of things. So like an irrational fear of cats or of spiders would be an example of the second kind of the raw material, the kind of raw material that is unique to us. And so all people are truly fearful of things which are truly dangerous, but not all people are afraid of all the things that people are afraid of. Personally, I have no fear whatsoever of spiders. You could put spiders all over me, and I would have no problem. Because I've even had a spider bite, but I just take the antibiotics and I'm good. Other people are incredibly fearful of spiders. I suspect there are people in this room who are fearful of spiders. But spiders, are not necessarily the same thing as the guillotine above your head. As a guillotine above your head is a true danger. A spider is maybe, it feels dangerous, but it's not actually dangerous. And so he says we have those two kinds of things going on as we go about making a moral choice. We have this raw material. He says the purpose of psychoanalysis, as distinct from Christian morality, is to remove the unnatural and abnormal feelings from us. He says on the top of page 90, the purpose of psychoanalysis is to give the man better raw material for his acts of choice. Morality is concerned with the acts of choice themselves. So then he gives the example of three people who go off to war. And of course, remember, he's writing this at a time when England was engaged in World War II. And so that was a very common experience to know of people who were going off to war. He says, so imagine that the first person who goes off to war has the normal amount of fear that would be part of that experience. Of course, there would be fear involved in going to war. That would be considered normal. But then has the psychological ability to manage that fear and do what is necessary as a soldier. So that's the first person. Then you have two other people, and these two other people do not have the psychological ability to manage their fear, and they are incapable then of doing what they need to do as soldiers at war. So imagine that a psychoanalyst comes and works with them and helps them through therapy to overcome their psychological issues. He uses the word cure. I don't know if psychologists would use the word cure, but imagine that a psychoanalyst comes and is able to cure those other two people of their psychological issues. Now, their ability to manage their fear is restored. One of them decides to go AWOL. That would be a moral choice that many of us, most of us probably would say would be an immoral choice. And then say the other person then, now having been restored psychologically, chooses to do what they're supposed to do. And so he uses this example to show us that where we have psychoanalysis helps us to get to a level playing field, Christian morality helps us to make the choice once the playing field has been leveled. On the bottom of page 90, he says, however much you improve the man's raw material, you have still got something else, the real free choice of the man on the material presented to him, either to put his own advantage first or to put it last. And this free choice is the only thing that morality is concerned with. He says on page 91, the bad psychological material is not a sin, but a disease. It does not need to be repented of, but to be cured. And he is building this case to take us to this point. Humans, he says, judge one another by external actions. God, on the other hand, judges people by their moral choices. And I would add here, humans, as we judge one another by external actions, we do so without the knowledge of what that raw material actually is for that person. Whereas God judges people by their moral choices with full knowledge of what that raw material looks like for that particular person. On page 91, he says, when a neurotic who has a pathological horror of cats forces himself to pick up a cat for some good reason, it is quite possible that in God's eyes, he has shown more courage than a healthy man may have shown in winning the VC. When a man who has been perverted from his youth and taught the cruelty, that cruelty is the right thing, does some tiny little kindness or refrains from some cruelty he might have committed and thereby perhaps risks being sneered at by his companions, he may, in God's eyes, be doing more than you and I would if we have given up life itself for a friend. And so a person who has a horrible psychological background, when they are able to do some little bit of kindness, some little act of mercy, his point is that God may view that as being much more honorable and much more commendable than a person who has no psychological baggage who does the same thing. And so the person who has better raw material should be expected to do greater things than a person who has more problematic raw material. And therefore, we shall not judge one another. It is important for us to acknowledge that we don't know everything about the people that we so quickly like to judge. So judgment is not for us to administer. So imagine being saddled with the psychological raw material of the most abused person you could imagine. How might we behave then? I kind of got ahead of myself, but he says on page 91, we see only the results which a man's choices make out of his raw material, but God does not judge him on the raw material at all, but on what he has done with it. This is why we are told not to judge. He then talks about life after death, and he says, when his body dies, all that will fall off him, and the real central man, the thing that he chose that made the best or the worst out of this material, will stand naked. We shall then, for the first time, see everyone as he truly is. There will be surprises. Because of our, don't go there. Because of our judgments, because of the judgments we have made of people, we may be surprised when the playing field is leveled to realize how well people did given the raw material they had to do it with. So back to the second point. Some folks think Christian morality is like a deal making with God. Like if we keep all these rules, then we'll be rewarded. C.S. Lewis thinks of it differently. He says on page 92, every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you are slowly turning this central thing into either a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature, either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God and with its fellow creatures and with itself. Each of us at each moment is progressing to the one state or the other. It's somewhat consistent with what we teach in the Methodist Church about sanctification, that we are in a progress. We are in a progressive way of life. Hopefully, by the sanctifying grace of God, we are becoming more and more like the person that God intended for us to be, who looks a whole lot like Jesus. But he says that at every choice, we are either moving in the direction of becoming that person God designs for us to be, or we're becoming the person God never intended for us to be. It's either we're moving towards being a heavenly creature or towards a hellish creature. And that is a matter of a series of choices that we make throughout our life. But, of course, we have to keep in mind that first point, which is that we do that with the raw material that we have, doing the best that we can with what we have. What matters most is how a person is progressing. He makes a last point in the chapter at the bottom of page 93. He says, "You understand sleep when you are awake, not while you are sleeping. You can see mistakes in arithmetic when your mind is working properly. While you are making them, you cannot see them. You can understand the nature of drunkenness when you are sober, not when you are drunk. Good people know about both good and evil. Bad people do not know about either." And so I think that's another point that drives us to that earlier point, which is that as people are struggling through life, they're doing it with the most amount of knowledge of themselves that they have. I mean, whatever they have is what they have, and therefore we should not judge. I think it's important for us to make this point about being non-judgmental, and I think he makes this point about being non-judgmental as we move into this next chapter, which and the one after that, which can lead to a fair amount of judgmentalism. So we move forward. Book 3, chapter 5, sexual morality. I was just remembering how last time I said the cardinal vices, and so I'm like really trying to make sure I say the right words. Okay, so sexual morality. He talks about chastity and says we should distinguish this idea from the idea of propriety. Propriety, he says, is socially construed. A Polynesian in the 1800s would have worn almost nothing, whereas a Victorian at the same time would have been covered from head to toe. The Polynesian may be more sexually moral than the Victorian, however, because it is not a matter of how much skin that's exposed that tells you how chaste a person is. On page 95, he says, "Chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. There is no getting away from it. The Christian rule is either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner or else total abstinence." Now, this is so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct, as it is now, has gone wrong. One or the other. Of course, being a Christian, I think it is the instinct which has gone wrong. I was quoting C.S. Lewis in that. So how about I pause there? I did a lot of talking so far, and I know you have thoughts and would like to say anything. Usually you raise your hand while I'm talking, but I'll pause to allow for any comments that you want to make. Otherwise, I'll just keep going.
Different things, and I wasn't thinking about it. It still came in my mind, and back and forth. And this little bit here that's scary to me, at least. Maybe y'all get on, but that everything that we do, whether it grows inside or not, which way it grows, that I'm going to be stuck with for eternity. I'm happy to say Jesus is my Savior, and I'm going to go to heaven. But what if I go with this little bitty twisted thing that's not bigger than that for eternity? Because I haven't done anything to nurture it and grow it. And That's something to think about.
Right.
You know, and when you're talking about choices, what is a no choice?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how many times have I come up to something, or y'all have come up to something other, and you have to make a decision, and you just kind of let it slide.
Mm-hmm.
You don't do either.
That's a choice.
That's a choice. But sometimes maybe those choices are the worst choices because they're the easiest and they're, well, I didn't do it. I didn't do it, but.
Well, and I think he would say that every single choice is going to be impacted by that raw material that he talks about. And so,
Chances are, if we make a bad choice or we just let something slide, that is a result of all of that raw material. And I take comfort in thinking that God will forgive me of that raw material. Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes. It is, word is the point, yeah.
I've never committed adultery, I don't cheat, but I do a lot of other stuff.
Sure.
I let things go by that at the time I think is bad, but I don't correct it.
Mm-hmm.
No, we've got a lot of friends that are very prejudiced and I hear nigger and all that kind of stuff.
Mm.
And instead of standing up and saying something, well, yes, when I was younger, nigger wasn't considered that bad a deal. You know, from the South, you heard it.
So that would be some raw material to deal with.
Right. Well, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
something was just nigger, you know? It's just, that's what you hear.
Mm-hmm.
And you know it, but grown out of that, I don't say it. Didn't say it much, did we? My daddy got all over it one time, but just, I had to say yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, to old black people, older black people. Because you respected the age and the person. And some of my friends thought I was crazy because I was saying yes, sir, to a black man who was doing yard work. That's what I grew up with.
Yeah.
But, what have I done?
Right. I think Rick had something he wanted to say.
Well, I think the whole point we're trying to make here is that God takes the raw material into account,
Yes. God takes the raw material into account.
and so should we.
Yes.
We often don't.
But if somebody thinks they've got bad raw material, you know, it's kind of a disincentive to do anything about it.
Mm.
It gives you an excuse.
It's an excuse. I can't help it, that's the way I was raised.
Well, that's not helpful, yeah. Linda?
I'm jumping into this next chapter, in this first part, the section we just talked about, because it's such a hard, Nancy and I were just saying that, mentioning that we put such a big emphasis on the sexual morality or immorality. We put more emphasis on it than God does. And I think it's so hard to talk about this because it's such like somebody already said before class started, we shouldn't be talking about this. But I think at one point, like when we talk about dress, how we dress, every year when we go in UM Army, I've got my high school students and we have a dress code. And they have fought me on it every year of saying, but that's not how we normally dress.
Yeah.
We dress the way we dress because we're comfortable dressing like this, and that's how we want to dress. And it is every year of telling them, but, Cindy, you're going to be up on a ladder, and you're going to have two boys below you holding that ladder. What will those two boys see? And so it has to be taking them out of their, it'd be like taking a Polynesian woman and putting her in Victorian era, and it would be a whole different ballgame.
Sure.
And so I think sometimes we have to be very conscious of what might be comfortable for you, where you are in your setting is one thing,
Right.
but it puts a whole spin. And I think our kids have a hard time understanding that.
Yeah.
Because they look at it as, well, this is what I wear.
Right.
I wear this all the time, and I'm comfortable with it, and all my friends wear it.
Uh-huh.
And I'm thinking, okay, that's great, but we are in a different situation. And we have to dress in a way that's going to be, I hate to say appropriate, because that sounds so, I don't know, prudish, but we have to dress in a way that respects everyone there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, as I said, it's just a hard line to choose sometimes, because the kids don't understand it, and some of the adults even go, I don't get what's the big deal? Why do I have to change my shorts?
It could be that the reason why people get so wound up about it is because there is a confusion that the way that you dress has some kind of correlation to chastity.
Yes.
So let's talk more about chastity.
Can I ask you one
Yeah.
thing? What was the VC that they talked about on 91? What does that mean?
Does anybody know what
Cross.
Victorian cross?
Victoria Cross.
What, can you explain what that is?
Yeah, we didn't.
It's the highest medal for valor that the United Kingdom can give. They've
Similar to
had
our
the
Medal of
medal
Honor.
for twice the length we've had the Congressional Medal of Honor and given only a fourth the number of medals that we've given. So it's extraordinarily high.
Extraordinarily.
What is it again?
Victoria Cross, named after Queen Victoria. And,
Maybe because none of us knew what that meant.
Yeah, so that, did you all hear that?
That English stuff kind of messes.
The question earlier was what the VC was, and not everybody at this end of the room knew what that was. Fred explained that the VC is the Victorian Cross, which is a Medal of Honor that's incredibly honorable. It's a high honor to receive that. And British military. Okay.
Interesting that as a trivial point, we're all familiar with the charge of the Life Brigade because the Russians were moving guns, and the brass that's in the Victoria Crosses come from the cannons that the Life Brigade captured in their famous charge.
Ah, interesting. Huh.
And they only have a few chunks of steel,
Oh, really?
brass left to make any more.
Huh. So it is a real honor. Okay. Let's see.
So there is a distinction between chastity and propriety, he makes. On page 95, he makes the point, chastity is the most unpopular of Christian virtues. He goes on to say further down, he says, the biological purpose of sex is children, just as the biological purpose of eating is to repair the body and provide energy for work. So I don't think he's saying that that's the only purpose of sex, but as he's building up this case here, he wants us to say, yes, the biological purpose of sex is children in the same way that the biological purpose of eating is to repair the body and provide energy for work. He then makes a comparison of food and sex and how if we treated eating food in the same kind of ways that we do sex, it would probably seem very odd. If we were to present food in the same kinds of techniques and manners by which sex gets presented, we would think it was probably pretty silly. If I covered up a donut and had some body music going on and showed it to you briefly, that would be strange. That would be strange. Most of us would agree, I think. And yet that's how sex gets presented as in all kinds of ways that you all know about. So, some of you better than others. Anyway, on page 97, he says, we have been fed all day long on good solid lies about sex. He says, we have been told, till one is sick of hearing it, that sexual desire is in the same state as any of our other natural desires, and that if only we abandon the silly old Victorian idea of hushing it up, everything in the garden will be lovely. It is not true. They tell you sex has become a mess because it was hushed up. But for the last 20 years, it has not been. It has been chattered about all day long, yet it is still in a mess. So there is a message that gets put out there which says sex is nothing to be ashamed of. And by that, we maybe meant something like, there is nothing to be ashamed of in the fact that the human race reproduces itself in a certain way, nor in the fact that it gives pleasure. C.S. Lewis says, if they meant that, they are right. Christianity says the same thing. It is not the thing, nor the pleasure, that is the trouble. So Christianity affirms that there is nothing bad about the body, or bad about pleasure, or sex in and of itself. Christianity approves of the body. Christianity is in no way anti-body or anti-material. Remember, God became flesh, and therefore God affirmed the value of the body, affirmed the value of the material world. The material world is not an inferior place to God. Heaven meets earth in Jesus. God becomes flesh. And so this is an important foundational concept in our consideration of sex. C.S. Lewis's complaint is that when people say there is nothing to be ashamed about with sex, what they may mean is that the state into which sexual instinct has now gone is nothing to be ashamed of. And he would say, this current state is not right. So when people say sex is nothing to be ashamed of, what he's thinking is that when people say that, what they really mean is there's nothing wrong with the way that we as modern people feel and talk about and deal with sex. There's nothing wrong with it. But he would say, actually, there is something wrong with it. And so he says, we may not be the ones to blame that we've inherited a situation from our ancestors. He says on page 99, there are people who want to keep our sex instinct inflamed in order to make money out of us. Because, of course, a man with an obsession is a man who has very little sales resistance. God knows our situation. He will not judge us as if we had no difficulties to overcome, as was made clear in the previous chapter. What matters is the sincerity and perseverance of our will to overcome them. He tells of a person who prayed with his lips, "O Lord, make me chaste," and yet in his heart he was secretly adding, "But please don't do it just yet." It is difficult for us to even want to be completely chaste. Our warped natures tell us, and so do those demonic forces that continually tempt us, that the desires we are resisting are so natural and healthy that to resist them would be abnormal. Of course, if we were to surrender to all our desires, it would lead to many bad things. Really, for us to be truly happy will include resistance to our desires. He says on page 100, every sane and civilized man must have some set of principles by which he chooses to reject some of his desires and to permit others. He says the real conflict is not between Christianity and nature, but between Christian principles and other principles in the control of nature. For nature, in the sense of natural desire, will have to be controlled anyway, unless you are going to ruin your whole life.
And that's on anything, don't you think? I'm sorry, Bridgie. Isn't that on anything? I mean, you gotta kind of stay in the middle on most things, right?
He's really referring to all our desires. Yeah, that.
Sorry, Bridgie.
Yeah. Frenchie.
Well, I think Paul covers this pretty good when he talks about this, because he advocates no marriage initially. But he gives an out when he says if you burn with passion, then it's better to get married.
Right, which most people do. So
Right.
I think it was a sneaky way of affirming marriage in a healthy way. But anyway.
What's wrong with getting married?
No, he's affirming getting married.
Yeah.
Getting married about 5 times.
No. Well, then again, it's like keep it in the middle. It's like, you know, how they talk about how alcohol is not bad in and itself, but if you take it to extreme, then you're in trouble. Food in and itself isn't bad, but if you take it extreme, you're in trouble, right? I mean, it's just all across the board.
You get
Right.
fat.
You get mad or get married 5 times, you know, that would be kind of rough too, so, yeah.
Okay.
People have the notion that Christian chastity is impossible. But to not attempt something because you think it is impossible is a poor way to live. When we attempt to do things that appear to be difficult, we often find we are capable of much more than we at first thought. So to just say, well, chastity is impossible, and then never attempt it is just as weak as saying, well, getting an A in this class is impossible, therefore I won't even try studying. I mean, his point is we're capable of a lot more than we realize. I missed something in the back there.
I did a hard class, I'm like, great, gee, I can't make a good grade, might as well not.
Okay. Well, C.S. Lewis would have different advice for you.
So, John, I want to ask you, what do you think about, like how the Catholics?
A little bit of chastity is better than none at all.
I'm sorry?
A little bit of chastity is better than none at all.
I think what he's talking about is our sincerity and our intentionality. That we ought to be sincere and intentional about being chaste.
So,
Yeah.
that would infer that, casual sex is okay if there's no intent.
I didn't follow you
I
there.
don't agree with that.
You're not entering into that, pretty casually, recreationally. There we go, that's where recreational versus a long-term relationship. And what you just said sort of draws a line there. Maybe this is okay, and
Oh, that was not what I intended by my words at all.
we hear this all
There's
the
a
time.
chair right there. You can sit.
We hear this all the time. Girls are chicks. Boys, it's not expected. Boys have recreational sex. They look at it that way. But we got chaste girls over here, and then the little pie, slice of pie, it's not. So maybe from not being a guy, I'm looking at this recreational sex is okay because my intent is not sincere. They know that. We're not entering into a lifelong love relationship. This is recreational. She accepts, and we leave those girls alone. So is this recreational without being insincere or breaking a promise? That maybe is okay versus the other side where you get married and you stay together forever.
So my understanding of chastity is that sex is appropriate and good and wonderful inside the covenant of marriage. Any sex outside of the covenant of marriage would not be considered chastity. And so what he's doing here, I think, is promoting chastity according to those boundaries. So I'm having a hard time following. I'm not sure I'm struggling here.
That's okay, neither am I. Linda would probably address this better because she hears more of this, the confusion that's there. Being old and old-fashioned, I get this, and always did, but I'm not 18 anymore.
You know, I think part of this question is chastity a binary choice? Is it a yes or no, or can you be a little bit chaste or a whole lot chaste?
That's what Wayne said.
You know, that seems what I'm reading here is he talks about perfect chastity. Because perfect is also imperfect chastity. What is that? Is that being a little bit chaste?
I see. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
I'd be a little bit pregnant.
It could be like, you never ever commit adultery or have sex outside of marriage, but you think about it a lot. So then it's not chaste anyway.
Right.
Okay, Jimmy Carter.
Well, no, that's what we're saying here. I mean, it's in our face constantly, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Every movie, every song, everything is constantly. And even at my great age, I kind of look around. But I never do anything about it, so that's not chastity, right?
Correct.
I have never committed it, but thought about it,
Correct.
what it might be like. Now, I know good way you have to.
Well, I'm afraid
But you mentioned you said you're right, and I did.
I think Marcia has something to say.
But it is a natural instinct to want to mate. It is an all of nature to reproduce.
Yes.
So I would not consider it unchaste to think about having sex because we live in a different period of time than our predecessors. It used to be, as soon as a woman went through menstrual cycle the first time, they were having babies until they dropped dead,
And that's
usually
why-
before the age of 20. in today's society, we become industrialized, which requires that we don't have babies, that we go to school, get education, wait for marriage. And so, thinking about sex, and especially with the delay after puberty, I think would be abnormal not to think about it. We are asking them to put off their sexuality when their biological clock has ticked.
Sure.
So it's going to take a lot of effort on their part, and bless them all, that deny their biological yearnings.
Mm.
Well, like the Catholic priests.
Yes.
That's a concerted effort. They've made the choice, biological urges or not. They're not doing that, right? So.
It has to be, I mean, just think about it.
Yeah.
It is there, it's there all the time. Once they go through puberty, it is a part of their lives that they want to mate, period.
Sure.
And I cannot
Just
pass
like
judgment, and I also realize too, that different people are born with different levels of sexuality. I mean, some people are bubbling over with urges, and other people seem to have less and can control it better. So I would be hesitant to condemn somebody or make a judgment because somebody was unchaste.
Right.
Because they may not be working with the same raw material that I am.
So what he's doing here is presenting Christianity as believed by most Christians over the course of Christian history. And what he's saying here is that chastity is a moral choice that Christians should choose. So,
a lot of them don't make it.
and of course, just as we should not gossip, but we all do it. I'm pretty sure, well, not maybe, maybe not all, but
Maybe not you.
not me or Amy, but the rest of you.
But I did hear this story about Amy that was really new.
Wilma?
People have a choice, what they want to do with sex, but, oh, never mind. I was gonna say something, but
It's okay, we'll move on. Let's move on.
It said in the book is, we stay in a constant hum. It's like a constant, like, idling all the time, because commercials, every bit of selling is done. I mean, you're selling macaroni and cheese. I'm watching now in the kitchen, I get this commercial, I'm thinking, what are they selling? Because it's all about sex, and they're selling macaroni. And it's like, it's a constant, our kids our youth are ingrained from the very beginning
Yes.
of being in this constant hum, and so that you have the church that comes in. Now, I'm not saying our church, but the church in general, this has been the downfall, is to say, no, 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 but the world is programmed around this of saying, stay in that constant state of ready, of hum, and it's like, it's such a hard conundrum to find yourself because it's at odds with everything going on around us, and then when we teach it, we don't teach it well. We look for negative. We look for everything negative of something that God made so positive, such a wonderful thing. We've turned it into a no, just a negative no, and so it kind of ruins it for, even in marriage. It's ruined it. It's like it's made it such a negative thing in so many ways. That I think, I mean, God just must be shaking his head and thinking, what have you done with something that I made so beautiful?
Right. And I don't think that I don't think that the message of what good, healthy sex inside the confines of a marriage, how wonderful that can be, I don't think that's a message that is being presented often enough. But to your earlier point, I would say we live in the world, but not of the world. We're called to live in it, but not of it. And remember that we will never have a Christian society until Christians follow Christ completely and we'll have a Christian society once we have a whole lot more Christians. And so that's the fact that the world is not as we would like it, just means we got a job to do. Jane?
I was gonna say this before, but you kind of touched on it, so I'll say it. In the middle of page 100, I had it marked for my reading. I think that part of our problem with this is, I guess, for me personally, who was a high school nurse for 23 years and taught sexually transmitted diseases in class, I think that part of the problem is that the only way that we approach it, like Linda said, is through scare tactics. And I think that he hits that right here in the middle of page 100. Surrender to all your desires obviously leads to impotence. That is medically incorrect, actually.
Well, he may be meaning powerlessness, not necessarily sexual impotence, but we're not sure.
Maybe it's mental impotence, I don't know. Disease, jealousy, lies, concealment, and everything that is the reverse of health, good humor, and frankness.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we all know that excesses of anything can lead to bad things.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of what Lynn was saying a little bit, I think the word she was really trying to use was intention. What is your intention? You're just having a one-night stand, you have no intention of ever seeing this guy again, whatever. It could have some of those bad consequences, but it's such a, as you said, conundrum to teach young people how to use this beautiful thing that God has given us. And I think it's hard as an adult to not, I can remember talking about the highest incidence of syphilis in the United States is in Houston, Texas. So if you want to go out there and have sex with just anybody you meet at the gas station, remember that you could be in that statistic the next week. But that's a little bit of a scare tactic.
It is.
But there's a lot of truth in it.
There's truth. Yeah.
And I also think that one of the biggest things that has ever changed, that has changed society that we don't talk about it, is the birth control.
Right.
And nobody really talks about that. There's also a North Branch, you can put in a girl's arm and she's infertile for 5 years. Well, you stick it in your 14-year-old girl's arm, and she's free to pretty much do what she wants. She's not going to be free of sexually transmitted diseases. But anyway, I had a hard time with that sentence there because he's using the same thing that we're using too.
Yeah. Okay.
But then it all comes down to what's talking about in 103, just to kind of move us forward, where it talks about the animal self and the diabolical self. That's it right there.
Okay.
Right?
Well, would it be all right with you if I just continue through my
That was for you today.
Otherwise,
I know. Keep going. Keep going.
Don't steal my thunder. Okay. Yeah. So, I'm sorry?
In this is when I'm talking with the fellows under forced chastity in prison.
Sure.
I get into some really interesting discussions. And it's an interesting thing that even there in our programs, we have a book on marriage and has a section on sex and we don't cover it.
Really?
So they seem to discourage, and Fred maybe talked to this, but they seem to discourage us talking about that. However, I don't go away from it. I don't know if I do any good in my talking, but it's hard to sell somebody on chastity who for 20 years has been under forced chastity.
All right.
Okay, so people have the notion that Christian chastity is impossible. He says that the key is to keep at it, that we would ask for God's help. Each time we blow it, we can ask for forgiveness, pick ourselves up, and try again. On page 101, he says, very often what God first helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but just this power of always trying again. This continual turning toward God for help, what we call repentance, cures our illusions about ourselves and teaches us to depend on God. And so I don't think that really is promoting the idea that you can be a little bit chaste and it's okay. but it's a matter of being realistic that, hey, we're not perfect people yet. And so the project of living in this world and living with God is this continual turning toward God for help. And I just thought it was a pretty neat idea that very often what that leads to is not necessarily the virtue, the accomplishment of the virtue, but is actually the power of always trying again, which can be a very powerful thing. And over time can lead to betterment. He says people often get thrown off track by this notion of sexual repression. He says that technically, repression does not mean suppressed in the sense of denied or resisted. Repression is about thrusting into the subconscious where it comes into the mind only in disguise. Therefore, sexual repression in the strict technical sense does not appear to the person who has truly repressed it as sexuality at all. So repressed sexuality will, technically speaking, will show itself in ways that don't look like sexuality at all. Chastity, he says, does not bring about repression, but brings about a greater knowledge of sex, not less. He concludes the chapter saying that sexual morality is not the center of Christian morality. And I think this is a key point, especially for youth ministry, that sexuality is not the chief concern of Christian morality. It is a concern, but not the chief concern. On page 102, he says, "The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport and backbiting, the pleasures of power, of hatred. For there are two things inside me competing with the animal self, which I must try to become." And here's Lee's favorite quote. "They are the animal self and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worse of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who regularly goes to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it is better to be neither." Did you want to say anything about that now that we got there?
No, I was just trying to help you move on.
Thank you. All right. Any other final comments on sexual morality before we move into the next and last chapter for the day? All right. Well, I thought this was his worst chapter so far, but that's just my opinion. We'll go for it, though. Yeah. It has some good parts, but it has some less than good parts. Anyway, that's my opinion. I'm sorry? Yeah. So anyway, we'll go for it. I shouldn't have said my opinion. A Christian marriage, he says, is based on Christ's words that a man and wife are to be regarded as a single organism, one flesh. This is to be taken as a fact. Male and female are made to be combined like a key and a lock, like a bow and a fiddle. The issue of sex outside marriage is that it isolates one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union which were intended to go along with it and make the total union. As stated before, there's nothing wrong with sexual pleasure, but isolating that pleasure from the total context is problematic. Just as we would not try to get the taste of food, the pleasure of the food, without eating the food which brings nourishment. Food is pleasurable to eat, but it is in the context of nourishment that it belongs. Marriage, he says, is for life. Or marriage, the Bible says, is for life. Divorce is debated. Some denominations allow it, some do not at all. The ones that allow it see it as a desperate remedy, like a surgery needed to preserve life. Others see it as being so violent that it can't be done at all. None of the denominations share the view that it is no big deal that people can just marry and divorce as they choose. So all denominations are in agreement that divorce is a very, very serious thing. But some are more lenient in allowing for it than others. Just as in the Bible, the Old Testament is much more lenient. It provides a lot more leeway for divorce than we find in the New Testament. So he brings... And that was part of the complaint and the criticism of divorce, is that it was very anti-woman in biblical times. It did not affirm the value of women. What was going on in that time was very unaffirming of the value of women. And so, in my interpretation, God hates divorce because he hates what it does to people. He hates especially how it ruins the lives of women and children. It does too. But in those days, apparently what was happening was that men would marry, they get tired of her, they divorce her, which left her destitute, and then he would marry somebody else until he was tired of her. And that was what was happening culturally.
The woman gets the children, and the father is left out. Quite often that happens, which is very harmful. And
It's
now
all
you're having
hard.
more of this joint custody type thing.
So pushing forward, he brings up another
virtue, which is justice. And he says that justice is he defines it as the keeping of promises. When people marry, they make a promise to stay together till death. If they have no intention to keep that promise, he says they should not do it. Then he talks about this idea of being in love. So there's this idea that we should only stay married as long as we are in love.
I've actually heard that recently in marriage. I was almost sick.
Sure. So people are affirming this concept in our day and age that as long as we are still in love, we'll stay together.
Instead of saying so long as we both shall live,
Right.
say so long as we both shall love.
Right.
Oh, really? Yes. It sickens me.
So what he says is that logically, that kind of approach leaves no room for the promise. There's no need for a promise if the only reason to stay married is being in love. I mean, if you're as long as you're still in love, why do you need a promise?
The feeling.
Yes, and he says being in love, and then later he kind of helps you see that he's talking about the feeling
Right.
rather than love as a commitment.
It's the action.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think we forgot that love is a choice. It's not a feeling or an emotion. It's what we decide.
Yeah.
And so when some of us nowadays, when they say I've fallen out of love, it just means they choose not to love that person.
Yeah.
In the same way, and if we follow Christ's last commandment and love others, why that would solve all of our problems. All of the rules on the other side of the second covenant, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's to love others, and
Yes.
just
So,
think what would that do to Congress if we?
so Herb makes the point that that love is not a feeling, love is a choice. I think C.S. Lewis would affirm that. But he talks about being in love
because that's the lingo that's used a lot in our society. He says on page 107, the curious thing is that lovers themselves, while they remain really in love, know this better than those who talk about love. As Chesterton pointed out, those who are in love have a natural inclination to bind themselves by promises. The promise to stay together, even if the couples cease to be in love, has several sound social reasons that he names, which are to provide, it's good for providing for children and to protect women. So when I kind of expressed a little bit of kind of discomfort with this chapter, it's just because some of the things that he talks about seem to me to be sexist, basically. So, which I would say is not a Christian value. So he says there is one more reason that is a bit hard to explain for why this promise is so important. He says, and Doug referred to this earlier, people prefer binary systems. Binary systems are easy for people to conceive. We tend to kind of go towards, you know what I mean by binary? It's just choice A, choice B, and there's nothing else. But there is also the notion that B can be better than C and A can be better than B. There's good, better, best, or bad, worse, and worst. He says on page 108, being in love is a good thing, but it is not the best thing. There are many things below it, but there are also things above it. You cannot make it the basis of a whole life. It is a noble feeling, but it is still a feeling. Knowledge can last, principles can last, habits can last, but feelings come and go. Being in love usually does not last. So if we only think of a binary system where it's either being in love or not being in love, then we have a faulty system, he would say. But if we understand that there is a whole spectrum and that there is good, better, and best, then it allows for us to affirm the value of staying committed in a marriage, even when it feels that we are no longer in love as a feeling. Doug?
Is in semantic definition, being in love, there's a lot of different kinds of love.
Sure.
And when people talk about being in love, I think they mean romantic love.
Sure.
And romantic love may not last forever, but the other stages of love can be more enduring.
You're right.
And so that's why you have to sort of parse what kind of love are you talking about.
Yes, good point. Yeah, and he doesn't do, I would say he doesn't do a great job of explaining what he means by being in love. But I think the context clues lead us to the idea, or at least it did for me, that by being in love, what he means is this very surface level, kind of very emotional, romantic, eros love, not filial or agape.
But ceasing to be in love, he says, does not mean ceasing to love. So he's going to lean into that parsing out of those terms. Love is deeper than a feeling. He says on page 109, it is a deep unity maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced by, in Christian marriages, the grace which both partners ask and receive from God. They can have this love for each other even at those moments when they do not like each other, as you love yourself even when you do not like yourself. I'll pause there to ask, have any of you in your marriages, no, I shouldn't ask that. That's a very deeply personal. Have you ever not liked me, Amy? Yeah, okay. But you've stayed in love with me, and you still love me, even when if she's even said to me, I love you, but I do not like you right now. And I think that's what he's talking about. So that's a good, yes.
101 says, after each failure, ask forgiveness, pick yourself up, and try again. Very often, what God first helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but just this power of always trying again. Love is the fact that your feelings lessen and intensify. It's a statement that love is not constant. It goes up and it goes down. And there are times when you don't like a person, but you still love them. And when you work through love to begin liking them again, you move up that spectrum of love.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I think sometimes, but that doesn't fall on the other person, it falls on you. Because, you know, I mean, I think we're commanded to, like, and the way I see it in my marriage is, like, whether I like him or not at the moment, I have to see him the way Christ sees him, you know, and be willing to offer that grace. And if when I make that choice, or my ability or inability to make that choice is based on that raw material, you know, that goes back to that raw material. And so it doesn't fall on him. It falls on me.
Yeah, I think that's true. And in the marriage liturgy that we use in the Methodist Church, there's this one line that I always like to really emphasize with couples, which is, in his sacrificial love, Christ gave us the example of love for a husband and wife. And then I like to unpack that by saying, the love that we are to have as husband and wife is a sacrificial love. It's a sacrificing love. And then I often will tie that back to the 5 love languages, where the concept of the 5 love languages is that the project is not for me to get her to learn my love language as much as it is for me to learn her love language and speak that language to her, even when it is not my own language. And when that's going on at the same time mutually, that's when marriages can really be amazing.
Yeah, it's a win-win that way.
It becomes a win-win. So, but it's a sacrificial love, and I think you're right, that it's not, when marriages get to the place where I'm demanding them and they're demanding me to be different, that's when things just go downhill. But when I'm demanding myself to be better for her and she's demanding herself to be better for me, that's when things get great. So I'm getting into marriage advice, I'm sorry, didn't mean to do that. Yeah. Reggie.
I'm glad you brought that up, because we are looking at someone who has trying to go insight from the outside. And he didn't touch that. I thought was very important that you brought that up, because I think he's missing that part of it in his, because you all realize he's not married.
Yeah, he admits that too.
Right.
Yeah. He admits that.
I think that sometimes whenever we talk about marriage, and when people get divorced, they forget when they say these marriage vows, you're making a covenant with God. You're promising God to be faithful and true to this person, and you shouldn't take that lightly. I mean, because you're promising God first of all, and then to this person you're marrying the second time, you're saying that I love you. Then we need to not confuse, oh, I love you, as I have passion for you. There's, a whole different concept there too.
Right.
But this covenant with God, when you promise God or go into covenant with God, that's serious business. If you break a covenant with God, you're in trouble.
Sure.
Whether it's a divorce vows or, a marriage vows or whatever.
Thank you. So he says there is
This notion of finding the right person with whom you can be in love with forever. This can lead to faulty conclusions. There was another little thing I wanted to say first. He says being in love is the explosion that starts the engine, but it is the quieter love built on promise that keeps the engine running. And then he says there is this notion of finding the right person with whom you can be in love with forever, and this can lead to faulty conclusions when the explosion dies down, thinking there is something terribly wrong. So most relationships begin with this very explosive emotional thing. That's what gets the thing going. But the promise is what helps us to settle into more of a long-term deal. It relates to the idea that letting the initial thrill settle into a quieter, deeper enjoyment is a key to happiness. He says on page 111, if you decide to make thrills your regular diet and try to prolong them artificially, they will all get weaker and weaker, fewer and fewer, and you will be a bored, disillusioned old man for the rest of your life. Yeah. So I'm learning how to enjoy the glide of surfing rather than just the thrills. So that I won't be a bored old man, but I will be a happy old man in the sea. So anyway, oh yeah. It took me a while, but I got there. Another faulty notion is the idea that falling in love happens to us like getting the measles. That's why some will give up on their marriage when they feel attracted to someone else. And boy, let's just be honest. It is entirely possible to be happily married and yet feel attracted to another person. But to think, oh, that must mean that this is the wrong person and they're the right person would be a very faulty conclusion. He expresses the opinion that the church should not press its views on marriage and divorce onto those who are not Christian. He says on page 112, and this this was another part where I had a little bit of, personally, just a little bit of trouble. And I'll explain. Okay, so he says on page 112, Christian wives promise to obey their husbands. In Christian marriage, the man is said to be the head. And so the trouble that I have is not so much from where it talks about this whole notion of submission. I think there is a very reasonable, very healthy way of interpreting and understanding that passage. But I think he goes to a place that some of us might not want to go. So some of us would really, really not want to go. So could be. But he says, what about equality? I'm just going to present it. Don't throw any darts. What about equality? Why should the man be the head? He says, there needs to be a head. If the two are in constant agreement, there is no need for a head, but most will have disagreements. How else will you decide something unless someone is the head? You can't get a majority vote when there are only two. Now, I'll pause there and say, I think it's okay if within a marriage there is an agreement between the couple that this is how we're going to do things. I'm less comfortable personally with saying this is how it needs to be for every couple. And as I said earlier, I think there is a different way to interpret that Ephesians passage where I think this comes from. To the question, if there is to be a head, why the man? He makes the claim that women don't appreciate seeing another woman bossing around her man. He says a woman is primarily fighting for her own children and husband against the rest of the world. She is the special trustee of their interests. The man's job is to protect other people from the intense family patriotism of the wife. And so that's the chapter. Okay, Doug.
A couple of pages, whatever, it's patently absurd.
Okay.
It's very sexist.
Okay.
And very much what may have been viewed as traditional roles 75 or 80 or 100 years ago. So I think it has very little relevance today.
Fair enough. Would anybody, and I want to keep a spirit of openness and non-judgmentalism here. So if anybody wants to affirm what he said, I think we want to hear that. Okay, Linda.
I'm not, believe me, I can get my hair to the back of my neck standing up when I read something. But if I look at this, okay, if I take you and Amy as a marriage and say, an ideal marriage, the way God intended it.
Whoa.
This is an example.
Okay.
Is you know your wife so well, and you want what is best for her. And so you will lean into her decisions as you make decisions because you know Amy and you want the best for both of you. And so if you are the spiritual head of the household, the head of the household, however you want to put it, but you're not a dictator. You love your wife and you want what's best for her. And then in turn, she trusts you to always have her best interests at heart, and she will always rally for you and stand beside you. But the problem is that's not what marriage is anymore. It becomes sometimes in some churches. I'm not saying this church, but some churches use it as, well, we're going to Ephesians passage. You listen to your husband because he's the ruler, and it's used in a different. We become oppressed because of that, and I don't like that. But I think in the intent, if I look at that in the way of saying you love your wife, and the decisions that you make are not your decisions, it's y'all's decisions because you know her so well, and you would hope that your intent is that you know her well enough that you share your each other's fears, desires, what you want, that you share it enough that you're in tune with each other. And then if it's not right, then Amy would come to you and say, we need to talk about this.
Well, when we make decisions for each other without talking, it usually doesn't turn out well.
Doesn't turn out well.
Alan?
I don't know if me and my wife's circumstances are unique, but we are both trying to please the other so much She's trying to please me, I'm trying to please her. We drive each other crazy.
Well, that's not normal. I'm just joking.
Fred?
Wow. In support of what Doug said, I think too, there's been a normal, healthy evolution of role change that not, maybe 2 generations ago, the wife was a homemaker and the husband was breadwinner. Today, that role has changed a lot. A lot of people are both equal breadwinners, at least. Maybe the wife is still the majority homemaker. But as that role has changed, so does the interpretation of a book that was written 50 years ago has to change too.
Mm-hmm.
But there's one word that I found missing in that whole chapter that I wonder where religions, and I'm assuming religions other than just Catholic have, is the word annulment. I don't see annulment in here at all. But I'm particularly remember when my sister remarried and chose to marry within the Catholic Church that time, that to really be a full participant and participate in everything with her husband, it cost them a lot of money and a lot of documentation to Rome to get her first marriage, which produced 2 children, and all of this, as they didn't, the church wouldn't use the word divorce, but they would grant an annulment, even though there were many children from the prior marriage and all of those things. So are other faiths commonly using annulment?
We don't have that in the Methodist church.
How do you annul children?
Yeah, how do you consider children annulled?
Yeah. That was the question,
There's
really.
only one way to produce them.
We knew a Catholic priest that his marriage had been annulled. He had 5 kids.
And what does that even mean?
Lynn has a comment.
Cover up.
Based on an article, and there's an old American spiritual that says this. This is all there is, ain't no more. Eve got the apple, Adam got the core. It's an old American spiritual.
All right. So let's
You're hiding in the corner.
let's close with prayer. And I'll just say this comment. I hope that we are all in agreement that however we think on these things, that we still remain one, and that we allow one another the freedom to think as we think. And I think we do. I mean, I think y'all are very, very gracious to one another, and I appreciate that. Let's pray. God, you have in mind for us a life that we don't always grab onto, and you want for us to have a life that's filled with blessing, so that we can be a blessing to others. And so we pray, God, that our time together would be beneficial to our development as your children in this world. And we pray, God, that you would bless us as we go. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.